Okay, folks, so thanks for coming along on a cold night to hear a discussion on nuclear energy in Australia, Two Views. And I'll introduce our speakers briefly. We're going to start off with Tony Gray. Now, I'll introduce him briefly. Studied at the University of Toronto, practiced law, worked as a Shakespearean actor, and most importantly for this event tonight, founder of the publicly listed Pan-Continental Company. Those of us who have been around for a while have seen a lot of Tony Gray talking his case, and he writes occasionally for the Australian Financial Review and the Australian. And Max Douglas, who's a policy analyst at the McKell Institute, studied economics at the University of Adelaide, law at the University of Melbourne. He writes on economics, industrial relations and energy policy, and writes occasionally for the Sydney Morning Herald and the Guardian. So we're going to start off with Tony going for about 15 minutes, Max about the same. Questions and discussion finish at the top of the hour. Tony Gray, you're very welcome.
Gerard has made me promise to make my address shorter than the one that Donald Trump just made. So I will comply. Following years of slowdown, after the Fukushima accident in 2011, nuclear power is enjoying a renaissance. The shock interruption in Russian oil and gas supplies to Europe after the Ukraine invasion has combined with climate change anxieties to redirect attention towards nuclear, a widely available and carbon-free energy source. The latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change states that its target of keeping the rise in average global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2050 cannot be achieved without the contribution of nuclear power. And at the recent COP28 climate conference in Dubai, 22 countries pledged to triple their nuclear generation by 2050. Chris Bowen, our energy minister, was there. He wouldn't have had any trouble in agreeing to join the others because his nuclear policy could be tripled without any breach of the policy, because 3 times 0 is still 0. Around the world, there has been a significant abatement in fears which have animated the anti-nuclear movement since its 1975 start in the United States under Ralph Nader. The effluxion of time has placed safety, the number one issue, in perspective. Since the commencement of nuclear electricity in the 1950s, over 70 years ago, there have been only 3 accidents where human life was threatened. In fact, death from a direct nuclear cause occurred in only 1, that's Chernobyl. The deaths that occurred at Fukushima were caused by the tsunami. All deaths should be treated with concern, but natural compassion shouldn't obscure the remarkable safety record of nuclear power. Former chief scientist Alan Finkel has said about nuclear, quote, "The deaths from accidents and air pollution per unit of electrical energy generated are comparable with solar and wind power," unquote. And he estimated that coal was 50 times more deadly. There is still concern, however, about high-level nuclear waste. It's a serious enough matter, but the quantum is not large. The annual high-level waste produced by the entire world could be stored on a football field 2 meters high. Waste disposal technology has been known for decades. It's based on incorporating the waste in water-resistant minerals and burying it in geologically stable formations. Australia has plenty of those. So, if the technology is there, why isn't it in use? It's because of the NIMBY syndrome. The problem is socio-political, it's not technological. But that's changing. Finland is embarking on a permanent storage system. Their technique is to encase the waste in cast iron and copper cylinders and wrap them in bentonite clay. Bentonite is impervious to water. The Finns have located an appropriate site at Onkalo in the west and have obtained local community support and approval by the federal government, which incidentally includes the Green Party. The project is currently under construction and is expected to be in operation within a year from now. Once that happens, it's likely that the NIMBY effect in other countries will be abated. At present, 32 countries have nuclear power, with 440 reactors supplying 10% of the world's electricity. Another 60 are under construction, and a further 110 are planned. China is leading the charge with 23 reactors under construction. Proof of the nuclear renaissance lies in the price of uranium, which has moved from $20 US a pound to $86 a pound today, US dollars. The nuclear renaissance is aided by the take-up of small modular reactors, defined as reactors with a capacity of 300 megawatts or less. Because of their modular form, SMRs can be manufactured in batches to a single design, which reduces unit costs and facilitates the streamlining of regulatory approvals. The smaller ones can be transported on trucks to remote sites, such as mines, obviating the need for diesel to fuel generators. BHP has been lobbying the government for this, and Russia has one operating at a Siberian gold mine. 30 countries are building or planning SMRs, and 20 more are considering them. Despite the resurgence of nuclear, legislation passed in 1998 prohibits nuclear power generation in Australia. However, there is rising public support for repealing it. Recent polls indicate 2/3 of Australians are in favor of a repeal. The opposition is responding sensibly to the changing nuclear world, with Peter Dutton announcing a policy to build 7 large-scale reactors and 2 SMRs. The role of nuclear could be twofold. The plants could generate power entirely by themselves, or act as an emission-free firming agent for renewables when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. At present, coal and gas provide the baseload service. There is, in reality, no emission-free alternative at the moment. Fossil fuels will have to continue their role if nuclear doesn't fill it. Chris Bowen vaguely suggests that batteries, which could store energy when renewables aren't operating, could be the firming agent. But crucially, he fails to admit that grid-scale batteries don't exist yet. Current batteries don't have large enough capacity. So much R&D is still to be done that the big ones are years away from becoming a reality. Notwithstanding the clarion call of nuclear, the Albanese government is stubbornly maintaining the political left's antipathy to it, a bias which is sickly door with a pale cast of ideology. Because the traditional anti-nuclear arguments have lost their force, the ALP is turning to the economic field with fallacious claims. It's what they did in their opposition to uranium mining. Their anti-nuclear ideology has a long history. Chris Bowen is claiming that nuclear plants are too expensive and would take too long to build. He bases his claim on the flawed GenCost report commissioned by the CSIRO. Neither the CSIRO nor the GenCost staff contain any experts in the construction or operation of nuclear power plants. GenCost outsourced its nuclear task to Oricon Consulting, which is an engineering firm. It's a good reputation, but also has no nuclear expertise. The whole exercise is marred by the absence of any input by nuclear specialists. The CSIRO did invite expert submissions, but promptly ignored them all. It's clear that the government expected the GenCost report to come up with findings supporting its claims of high cost for nuclear, and it complied, but with the aid of flawed assumptions and data. The errors led the report to reach the preposterous conclusion that nuclear power would cost twice as much as renewables. For example, GenCost claims that the capital cost of SMRs would be $16,000 per kilowatt hour. That's almost 3 times what is disclosed in a report from Canada, which actually is building SMRs. Even making allowance for the different conditions in Australia, the assertion is astonishing. GenCost flagrantly distorted the application of levelized cost of electricity when comparing nuclear with renewables. LCOE comprises both capital and operating costs spread over the life of the generating asset divided by the electricity output. Clearly, the length of time over which the asset is amortized can be critical to the calculation of cost. GenCost assumed that the life of a nuclear plant was 30 years, when its real life is 60 to 80 years, over twice as long as the life of solar and wind plants. Also, it assumed all wind farms would be onshore, when the government's policy is to include many of the offshore variety, which cost more. A further erroneous assumption was that nuclear reactors would only operate at 50% of their capacity, increasing their LCOE significantly, when every nuclear expert knows they operate at around 92%. When nuclear plants act as firming agents for renewables, they would operate at somewhat less than their full capacity. However, while renewables are producing, some of the nuclear output could be stored in small batteries, not the big ones, the small ones. That would result in their operating at less than 92% capacity, all right, but certainly more than 50%. In another flurry of hyperbole, GenCost took the capital cost of a recently built large-scale Korean reactor and almost tripled it, alleging that the exaggeration was justified by Australian conditions. If the GenCost people had properly consulted nuclear experts, they would have been forced to reach the inconvenient conclusion that the real costs of nuclear are dramatically lower than what they claimed. For instance, Tony Irwin, a nuclear engineer and the CEO of SMR Nuclear Technology in Australia, who has actually run nuclear plants in the UK, says that after appropriate adjustments for GenCost's fudging, nuclear would actually be 50% cheaper than renewables. There are other factors not given appropriate weight in GenCost's report. For instance, a full deployment of renewables would require 15% of Australia's land mass, larger than South Australia, and it would need a third of the country's agricultural land. On the other hand, Peter Dutton's plan for 7 reactors would need only 21 square kilometers in total. And were nuclear plants to replace coal, as provided in the Dutton plan, they could use existing transmission and other infrastructure. And instead of losing their jobs, workers could be retrained to work in the new industry. Contrary to what Chris Bowen claims, nuclear plants require only slightly more water than coal plants. In any event, they can use air-cooled condensers, as the Cogan Creek coal plant in Queensland does. No account is taken of the district heat nuclear plants can offer. Since they operate by heating water to create steam to drive the turbines, they can provide heat for the public. In Europe, 60 million people are currently kept warm in winter by 3,500 local district heating networks supplied by nuclear waste heat. The other spurious argument is that nuclear would take too long to install. For that contention, Chris Bowen relies on GenCost's exaggerated claim that it would take 15 years to bring nuclear plants to production. Since the construction time would be 3 years, as GenCost admits, the pre-construction period would be a breathtaking 12 years. Tony Irwin estimates a more reasonable time frame would be 10 years from the date a project is decided upon. That's about the same as for wind farms. How is it that 32 countries, many of them wealthy like Australia, are powering ahead with nuclear if, as Chris Bowen claims, it's too expensive even to consider for us? And if nuclear is uneconomic, why is it that Ontario, Canada, which is 58% nuclear, is able to supply electricity at half the cost payable by New South Wales consumers? The answer reverberates around the world. Nuclear power is an economically attractive source of emissions-free electricity, ready to work with renewables to achieve net zero CO2 emissions. At the very least, Chris Bowen should consider that it is possible he could err and repeal the suffocating ban in order to open the door to the fresh air of knowledge. His obstinate reluctance to do that is evocative of George Orwell's 1984, where Big Brother says, "Ignorance is power." In the midst of the palpable discontent with the government's energy policies, we need a debate about nuclear which is not infected by ideology and which is free to look at the facts objectively, aided by experts actually relevant to the issues. If we were to do this, it's most likely that affordable and emission-free nuclear power would be selected to act as a helpful energy partner with renewables. But first, the ban must be lifted. To paraphrase John Lennon's famous song, "Give nuclear a chance." Thank you.
Many thanks, and now Max.
All right, can everyone hear me all right? So I'd like firstly to begin by acknowledging that we're here today on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Max Douglas. I'm not a Shakespearean actor, but I am a policy analyst at the McKell Institute, where I write about economics, industrial relations and increasingly energy policy. So we're a think tank that work with a broad cross-section of organisations, from charities to government to business to the union movement, to drive debate, build consensus and ultimately provide solutions. Thank you to Gerard and Anne for extending the invitation to be here tonight. The value of this style of discussion for the health of our democracy really can't be overstated, in my opinion, so thank you. And I'd like finally to thank my interlocutor, Tony Gray, for being here this evening. Your reputation certainly precedes you. And before I begin in earnest, you'll note that Tony and I see the GenCost report differently, and a lot of these assumptions I think are worth debating in the Q&A at the end, so that might be worth facilitating, Gerard. So it's my firm belief that a nuclear future, as embodied in the Coalition's policy announcement, is the wrong one for Australia. Not because I think it'll bring about the next Chernobyl or Fukushima, not even because of the appreciable concerns about where we put the waste, rather I think it just doesn't make economic or practical sense. The evidence to me clearly suggests that it's one of the most expensive forms of energy, that it's plagued with financial and temporal uncertainty, that it cannot meet Australia's growing energy needs, that it would, if commenced today, leave Australia a global energy policy outlier, and that it threatens to completely derail our energy transition. Peter Dutton has made it perfectly clear that he's happy for the next election to be a referendum on nuclear power. That means soon the Australian electorate, you and I, will get to decide on whether nuclear is the right option for Australia. My job this evening then is to present you the evidence as I see it, which has led me to my conclusions, and to hopefully bring you along with me. So the best evidence suggests that nuclear is one of the most expensive forms of energy. As Tony mentioned, when we take into account the build costs, the fuel costs, and the operating costs, we can arrive at a figure called a levelised cost of energy. This figure allows for a fair and fruitful comparison between different generating technologies. And according to the most recent CSIRO estimates, as I'm sure we can debate later, large-scale nuclear is around 2.4 times the cost of onshore wind and around 3.4 times the cost of solar. Even when we price in the additional storage and transmission costs required for firm renewables, at 90% penetration, large-scale nuclear remains around 1.7 to 1.9 times the cost of renewables. And this is without mentioning again the fact that the CSIRO's build cost estimates are taken from South Korea, a country with a multi-decade continuous building program. Australia, on the other hand, has never built a large-scale nuclear plant. We don't yet have the supply chains, the skilled workforce, or real-world experience to do so. To this end, the CSIRO note that our inexperience could lead to build cost premiums of up to 100%, or doublings in the cost of reactors. Small modular reactors, or SMRs, compare even less favourably. Based on the cost of a single attempted build in the United States, they come out between 3.9 and 4.6 times the cost of firm renewables. But even this figure, I think, needs to be taken with a grain of salt. The reality is that this technology will remain a pipe dream for the foreseeable future. To quote the World Nuclear Industry 2023 report, quote, "In the Western world, no unit is under construction and no design has been fully certified for construction. I know Ontario plan on building them, but as far as I know, none of the reactors so far have been approved for construction." But it's not just the CSIRO that come to these conclusions. So financial advisors with skin in the game and foreign regulators overseeing established nuclear industries come to similar, if not more costly, conclusions than the CSIRO. Bloomberg finds that the Australian nuclear cost would be, quote, "at least 4 times greater than the average cost of firm renewables." In the United States, investment bank Lazard find that nuclear energy, with very generous assumptions, comes in at 3.6 times the cost of onshore wind. And I think it's crucial to note that in those estimates, they assume that these nuclear plants were running at 92% capacity and had lives of 80 years. So these are the assumptions in the Gen Cost report that I think have been criticised that this Lazard model takes into account. And even in Ontario, Canada, a jurisdiction with a mature nuclear industry that is so touted by nuclear advocates, the energy regulator recently found nuclear to be 2.9 times the cost of wind and twice the cost of solar in their current energy mix as we speak today. So what do these cost estimates mean for us as taxpayers and as electricity consumers? They mean either we're on the hook for massive public subsidies as taxpayers or higher energy bills as electricity consumers. According to Professor Roger Dargaville, if Australia pursued nuclear, the typical retail tariff would rise from 25 cents per kilowatt hour up to 40 to 50 cents per kilowatt hour. That would mean an increase in energy bills of up to $1,000 per year. But these subsidies and price increases aren't just back-of-the-envelope academic exercises. Recent examples show exactly how costly nuclear endeavours can become multi-decade millstones around taxpayers and consumers' necks. For example, only in December, the energy regulator in Georgia in the United States approved an additional 6% increase to energy bills to meet the cost of cost blowouts at the Vogtle nuclear reactor. That was in addition to an earlier approved increase of 3%. The upshot then is that Georgian energy consumers are on the hook with an indefinite increase of 10% to their energy bills from one nuclear power plant. I'd ask you then to imagine what 7 plants might do to the Australian consumer. And in the United Kingdom, taxpayers rather than consumers are left on the hook in the form of price support schemes from the government for their recent Hinkley Point C nuclear power plant. The British government has promised to pay almost 50% more than the current market prices for electricity for up to 35 years to meet the cost blowouts. Some estimate that the total premium paid over the life of the agreement will be 220 billion Australian dollars. It's not pretty. But it's not just the exorbitant costs that make nuclear the wrong choice for Australia. Nuclear energy is fraught by significant downside uncertainties with respect to both the cost and the time to build. And these endemic uncertainties potentially leave taxpayers and energy consumers on the hook for billions in cost blowouts and never to arrive price relief. Georgia's Vogtle plant and the UK Hinkley Point C plant I just mentioned are illustrative examples. The Vogtle plant arrived 17 billion US dollars over budget and 7 years late. And the UK's yet to be completed Hinkley Point C plant has so far blown out from an original estimate of £9 billion to £34 billion and is set to come in 14 years behind schedule. And while these cherry-picked recent examples are useful, I think it's the data that brings the point home here. So in 2017, Professor Benjamin Sovacool and his co-authors analysed the time and cost overruns of 180 nuclear reactors. So it's quite a large sample size. What they found was that nuclear reactors, on average, had cost overruns of 117% on average, and time overruns of 64%. By contrast, that same study found that wind farms came in on average 7.7% over budget and 9.5% over time. Solar fared even better, coming in only 1.3% over budget and actually beating its estimated completion time. But over time, we actually seem to be getting worse at building nuclear power plants. In 2023, Professor Brent Flyberg, after accounting for some more recent builds that I just mentioned, found the average cost overrun to be 238%, noting a vicious cycle of negative learning. The World Nuclear Industry Report in 2023 found, quote, a clear global trend towards increasing construction times since 1954. On the other hand, in my opinion, the upside uncertainty for renewables is, to put it simply, astounding. Year after year, estimate after estimate, they just keep beating expectations. Globally, the past 12 years have seen 89% reductions in the cost of solar and 69% reductions in the cost of onshore wind. In Australia, project completion times have fallen for solar and wind by 50 and 61% respectively over just the past 15 years. All the while, the cost of a single kilowatt hour of firm battery storage has fallen by 99% over the past 30 years. But there's an even more basic point that I think undermines the Coalition's nuclear power plan, and that's that it simply won't produce enough energy in enough time to meet our needs as coal-fired power stations retire. The Australian Energy Market Operator, or AEMO for short, expect that our entire fleet of coal-fired power stations will retire by 2040, with the majority of that to happen in the next 10 years. But the CSIRO's projection is that, boldly assuming no delays, as Tony mentioned, Australia could not have a single reactor available till 2040. In other words, nuclear would not and could not act as an immediate substitute for our rapidly deteriorating coal-fired power stations. All the while, AEMO are clear, they need investment now. To quote their 2024 Integrated System Plan, quote, investment is needed urgently. New generation, storage and firming must be in place before coal-fired power stations retire and to meet Australia's growing demand for electricity. You might then ask which technologies can meet these pressing demands. AEMO is crystal clear. To quote them again, quote, renewable energy connected with transmission and distribution, firmed with storage and backed up by gas power generation is the lowest cost way to supply electricity. I think it's crucial to notice the point here that AEMO are clear that gas does have a role in our energy grid. Anytime you're told that it's 100% renewables plan, this is a lie. The AEMO are clear that gas will be the preferred peaking technology. But even if we do decide to pursue a nuclear future, the plan set out by the Coalition would provide only a drop in the ocean of Australia's fast-growing demand for electricity. According to Bloomberg estimates again, the proposed 7 gigawatts of nuclear energy would likely provide only 2 to 3% of our forecasted 2050 demand. But what about baseload, the kind of always-on factor that coal-fired power stations play now? Well, the era of baseload power is coming to an end. The baseload energy provided by nuclear will be fundamentally incompatible with the future structure of Australia's energy grid. Even now, as cheap renewables flood the grid during the day, our existing coal-fired power stations cannot compete and run economically at a continuous rate. I fear nuclear would suffer the same fate. Sure, we can just turn them on and off during the day when demand peaks, but this cycling, or ramping as we call it, leads to higher maintenance cost, a lower capacity factor, which we were talking about before, and sometimes even irreparable damage to the plant itself. A recent example in Germany where a plant actually broke from ramping too quickly. For an alternate vision, we might look to South Australia. So last financial year, it offered cheaper wholesale power than New South Wales and Queensland, while operating 0 coal-fired power stations and reaching up to 100% renewables penetration during the day. What role could always-on nuclear power conceivably play in a grid like this? It would bleed taxpayer money during the day, and unlike gas, could not be ramped up or down without significant inefficiencies. On the other hand, France, as one of the world's nuclear superpowers, offers us a warning, I think. Their baseload nuclear power stations are increasingly running at losses during the day and are being forced to turn off as cheap renewables flood the grid. And it's only by exporting their energy to their European neighbours that they can actually keep these nuclear power stations running. Many in the pro-nuclear camp claim that we're bucking the trend by not pursuing nuclear, that we're the only G20 nation not embracing nuclear, and that we are some kind of energy pariah. I think this couldn't be further from the truth. Moving towards nuclear at this point in time, and at this point in our economic development, would see us swimming against the tide. Germany, Italy, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia, all G20 members, produce no nuclear energy at all. The reality is that developed and developing countries alike are moving away from nuclear energy, relatively speaking. And even those moving towards nuclear are deploying renewables at much faster rates. Globally, nuclear's share of electricity production peaked in 1996, and plant construction peaked 45 years ago in 1979. And since 1996, the number of countries operating nuclear power plants has increased by 1, from 32 to 33. Of the 66 plant constructions since 2013, only 2 were in America or Western Europe. By contrast, 2/3 of new constructions occurred in China and India. And I think it's safe to say that our economy at this stage does not resemble a Chinese or Indian economy. But this figure then even disguises the fact that nuclear is an increasingly small part of even their energy mix. In 2023, China deployed 300 times more renewables than nuclear, with the nuclear declining to under 5% of total electricity generation. India deployed 16 times more renewables than nuclear. Even the United States, the world's largest producer of nuclear energy, it's expected that renewables will be deployed at 44 times the rate of nuclear in 2024. In fact, global nuclear capacity went down by 1.7 gigawatts last year. Renewables capacity increased by 507. Finally, I think the coalition's nuclear plan threatens to recklessly derail our current energy transition. The next decade, by all accounts, will be critical to meeting our decarbonisation targets and unleashing the associated economic opportunities. And we can't afford to take a single wrong step. A stable policy setting will be crucial to attracting and retaining private capital. Of the $122 billion required to transform our grid to 2050, the bulk will need to come from the private sector. And the coalition's Soviet-style plan to own, operate, and compete with private energy generators destabilises this investor certainty. It threatens to undermine our status as one of the world's most attractive destinations for private investment, and in doing so, our energy transition. And this means higher for longer power prices through diminished supply, and higher for longer emissions through extending the life of our ageing and dirty coal-fired power stations. Even while the coalition remain in opposition, the reverberations of their plan are damaging. Bloomberg states that, quote, the debate serves as a distraction from scaling up support for renewable energy investment, end quote, and that it, quote, will sound the death knell for Australia's decarbonisation ambitions. Although I fear maybe that's the whole point. To conclude, nuclear is a safe and proven form of zero emissions energy. But its desirability can only ever be assessed against the available alternatives and the prevailing policy context. And it's here where nuclear simply doesn't stand up. It's inordinately expensive, it is fraught with uncertainty, it cannot meet our energy needs. It is fast becoming outmoded around the world, and it threatens, perhaps intentionally, to undermine our energy transition. In 1971, we scrapped our nuclear ambitions because it was undercut by cheap and plentiful coal. 50 years later, nuclear is undercut by reliable and abundant renewables. The greatest transformation in how we generate and consume energy since the Industrial Revolution is now well underway, and we don't have any time to lose. Thank you.
You come from you seem to be out of kilter. You come from a generation that was hostile to nuclear energy. The Labor Party policy through the 70s and the 80s was against nuclear mines in Australia. So do you feel a bit out of place that that's all changing? And according to the opinion polls, younger Australians tend to support nuclear much more than older Australians. So do you feel a bit out of joint? So we'll start off with you.
We're both out of joint. Yeah, we're both out of joint. Okay. What's the question?
I can say something.
Well, tell because you were supporting nuclear energy when the Labor was strongly opposed to it. You were a bit unfashionable in those days. Now he's the unfashionable one with the youth, and you're unfashionable one with the older people. So tell us about that.
About the struggle to mine uranium.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, originally, going back to Gough Whitlam's era, the Labour government was very much in favor of nuclear. And in fact, Rex Connor, the energy minister, had a grand vision of having enrichment plants, UF6 conversion, and everything. And but that all changed in 1975. When the environmental movement wanted to expand itself in the United States after the peace occurred in the Vietnam War, which energized a lot of the protests. They wanted to have something new. Environment was the new thing, and nuclear was a very good extension, if you like, of the environmental movement, because it seemed to be unsafe. They were worried about radiation. Long-term waste disposal came a little bit later, but it was mainly safety and radiation that energized most people, and the protest growth. And that came over to Australia in the form of an NGO called Friends of the Earth. And that was an American one, but they came here and they got Australians to support it, and that changed the mind of the ALP, so that they became anti-uranium because they were anti-nuclear, and they lost the ALP lost the election to Malcolm Fraser, who had a different point of view, and he managed to get approvals through for new mines, only 3, and they got into production in the Pancontinental's ore body, which is Jabiluka up in the Northern Territory, which is uranium, but it's a polymetallic. It has gold and platinum group metals as well. At one stage, it was the largest uranium ore body in the world. It's been superseded now by Roxby Downs and perhaps a Canadian one, and we were all trying to get it developed, and the government asked me to get on the hustings and help promote the issue, which I was willing to do, and then at one stage that's Pancontinental had all the environmental approvals and government approvals we needed to go ahead. We just didn't have one, which was export approval. And by this time, I got to know Doug Anthony very well. He was the minister and also the deputy prime minister. Okay, I'll wind up quickly. We almost did it, but we didn't. And then the Hawke government came in and shut everything down.
So the suggestion that many of the younger generation in Australia support nuclear energy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it shows just how far we've come. Whoop, over here, sorry. I think it shows just how far we've come in our energy debate, right? Like I would like to think that the climate wars are over now, and the coalition, I kind of had to double check my ears for a sec when they started talking about clean, green, zero emissions nuclear energy. And I think also the debate around storage and kind of danger has been lost as well. I don't think many kind of thoughtful Australians think we're going to have a Chernobyl or Fukushima. I think, there's a debate about where we put the waste, and you would hope that in one of the largest countries on earth we could find somewhere. But I think everyone is generally okay that waste would be produced. But is everything right? But I think what gets lost is people see kind of clean, green, plentiful energy, and that's great, right? But as I said, I think the context of this, it's always relative to other technologies, and I think what gets lost in a lot of the kind of pro-environmental nuclear debate is the cost, right? Like you might have noticed today in my speech, I didn't fearmonger about Fukushima. I don't actually think that's a kind of proper argument to make here. I think that's been won. I'm not concerned about the safety of nuclear. I just think the economic aspect is overlooked and the practicalities are overlooked, especially in the context of our rapidly declining coal-fired power stations.
Yeah, we've got a question from Dimitri Bernstein on the Zoom. It's to Max. So what price does Max ascribe for the national security risk of sourcing solar and wind infrastructure from a geostrategic competitor, he means China, which likes to exercise its muscles through trade policy. Yes, a future made in Australia will subsidise production in Australia, but that will make solar even more expensive.
Yeah, I mean, sure. I get that point, really. And I think Future Made in Australia is a step in the right direction, right? I think critical minerals processing in Australia, there is a national security element to that. You have to admit that. But I think there's a similar issue for nuclear, right? I mean, we don't have any nuclear workforce. We're going to be essentially reliant on foreign firms to produce those first reactors that we ever make. So I think equally it kind of goes both ways.
Tony, you want to make a comment on that? You don't have to.
No, I don't.
You don't. Okay, so, first question here.
Okay, here we go. It seems to me when you said, talk about climate policy being determined by ideology, it's true. But I think the Labor Party, or the Labor government's attitude to solar and wind farms is also ideological. It's really not about the economy. At the moment, we're being told by the Minister that we have to have gas. Last year, he told us we had to get rid of gas. Mm-hmm. And it's all about staggering forward, staggering sideways and staggering backwards. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure about the figures. Everyone interprets them in their own way. You quote Germany as not having any nuclear plants anymore. Yes, they face the Mount of Fukuyama. They're in terrible trouble because of their energy policy is not delivering outcomes. They import most of their energy. Now, how can we get away from this ideological mindset and just be practical? Because it seems that the AMEO is saying we've got real problems down the road for blackouts because we're ideological in our attitude to energy. So could you give us some ideas on how it could be a lot more practical and a lot less ideological either way?
Yeah, well, okay. I think the argument, which I consider to be quite a false argument and a cover for ideology, is that it costs too much and it takes too long to build, but particularly the cost. So I think there has to be a proper demonstration that it doesn't cost too much. And I think if that were put forward in a convincing way, the right wing of the Labour Party would do the same thing on nuclear as they did on uranium. They would then topple the left. The left, the extreme left, will never change its mind on nuclear. It doesn't matter what you say. But the right wing of the Labour Party is a lot more sensible, and they can have an open mind ultimately to the facts as they go. So I think that's what will happen. In the case of uranium, the same sort of thing did happen. Uranium mining was attacked on the basis of economics too. Too expensive. The price of uranium was too low, you couldn't make any money, so why go through the angst of giving them approval? When the price of uranium went up from $24 to $44, it all changed, and the right wing of the Labour Party, led by Martin Ferguson, who was a major union leader at the time, they changed, and the Labour Party dropped its opposition to uranium. Well, I think the chances are the same thing will happen on nuclear when it is demonstrated that the costs are low enough, which I believe it can be demonstrated, but time has to do it. They've got to repeal the legislation first, otherwise we're just hidebound. We can't really get enough nuclear experts in here with major companies to tell us what the real costs are. So until that legislation is repealed, I don't think we're going to go any further ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's actually important to note that where Tony and I agree, because I think there's probably more areas where we agree than it's looking like. I agree, get rid of the ban on nuclear power. I mean, that was brought about in 1998 in ideological opposition to nuclear power. I say, let the free market decide. And I also say to Tony that, if nuclear power is cheap, then let's go for it. But I listed estimates from two investment banks, the Ontario regulator and our chief scientific organisation, that all said nuclear is one of the most expensive forms of energy. To Anne's point, I think it's kind of difficult to talk about ideology here. I mean, our net zero targets are in legislation now. Whether we like it or not, you can be agnostic on that, but that is in the legislation. So we have to balance between hitting our targets, which, the Parliament has said these are your targets, right, with, in our national electricity law, providing cheap and reliable electricity. And that's always going to be a balancing act. But again, I would refer you to AEMO, right? They say the lowest cost way to provide electricity at this stage is through firmed renewables with peaking gas. If the fastest way to do that was through nuclear, I'd be all for nuclear, right? But every estimate I see just suggests that it's not going to get us there in time. And if we do go with nuclear now, it means keeping those coal-fired power stations open for longer, which means probably not actually meeting our legislative targets. So there's a few things we need to balance, but under no circumstances, with the current estimates we have, do I see nuclear playing a constructive role in meeting those targets.
Okay, well, question down the back and here and there. You've got to be quick now. We're going to finish in 15 minutes. Yes?
Very quick question, Tony. Given the CSIRO are supposedly independent, why would they deliberately understate the life of a nuclear power station by some 50 years?
Well, I'm afraid I'll have to be blunt about that. I think that the what? Yeah, I think that the CSIRO has been persuaded by certain factors to come up with that Gen Cost report, which is shown to be completely flawed. I gave some examples of why it is flawed. So unfortunately, we've seen a movement which unfortunately started in the United States, where politics started to interfere with the justice system over there. We're all familiar there about that. Here, our input is that we're allowing the political imperatives to infect the scientific body.
So I'd like to comment on that assumption, right? So the CSIRO use what they call an economic life in their modelling, which is the total time it would take an investor to recoup all of their costs plus make some return on investment. So they estimated that for 30 years in the Gen Cost report. I think that is a bit of a low estimate. I'll agree with you. But again, I would point you to the Lazard modelling. That's a reputable US investment bank. They used an economic life of 60 to 80 years and 92% capacity. So it's on all the time, hitting American levels of generation, and it still came in more expensive than onshore wind. So I think that's worth bearing in mind, is that you can test these assumptions, but even when you start to stretch them, I don't see any under which nuclear looks more attractive than firmed renewables. And I think another point is that they've arguably underestimated the economic lives of some of the renewables in there as well. So I mean, they assumed a solar farm runs for 25 years. We're only just seeing now kind of solar farms retiring, but I can point you to an example of South Australia, where a solar farm has been extended for well over 30 years. So if we're going to start testing the assumptions of this report, I think it's worth being fair and recognising where they underestimate for nuclear and for renewables.
Before we go to the back, just got a quick Zoom question here. Just answer it quickly. The Zoom commentator saying to us, or questioner saying to us, well, what about Snowy 2.0, which was dramatically underestimated, which is now likely to be at least 4 or 5 times above estimated cost and at least 6 years behind. So the question is, if we're going to look at this problem for nuclear, isn't it also a problem for renewables or batteries?
Actually, do you want to go?
No, you go.
Okay. All right. So it is more directed at me. So Snowy 2.0 is well over budget and over time, right? I think it's blown out from $2 billion to $12 billion, and it's coming in something like 10 years late. That seems to be generally an indictment of our capacity to do mega projects rather than just deep storage, right? The question then is, would you trust those same firms to build nuclear power plants that take 15 years? I mean, I think that argument actually suggests more that we wouldn't be very good at building massive nuclear power plants that are more capital intensive and take longer to build.
Well, there's very little comparison between Snowy Hydro and a nuclear plant. Snowy Hydro had major geological difficulties that were not appreciated at the beginning, and they had to be resolved. In the case of nuclear, we don't have any geology to worry about, and there have been many plants built. There's a lot of knowledge that's built up. So the risks are, of course, still there. There's a risk in any construction activity, but but they are modified and they're easily dealt with. But you know, when people say it's going to cost too much for Australia, why isn't it costing too much for other countries? Why is it? And I said it before. Why is Ontario, Canada, powering ahead with nuclear? They've 58% nuclear. They're building some SMRs two SMRs at the present time. Why are they doing it? Why is their energy cost so low? We can't ignore the experience around the world, and also why at COP28. There were 22 countries that pledged to triple their nuclear propulsion before 2050 in order to help climate change problems. Why would they do a thing like that if it was uneconomic? So I really don't believe that these arguments that nuclear would cost too much for Australia are true.
Okay. No, we'll come back to you in a minute.
Oh, can I just respond to that briefly?
Okay, briefly.
Sorry, just on Ontario. So I think that's a jurisdiction that was in the media release. I think Ted O'Brien pointed to it as somewhere we should emulate. I think if you actually look deeper at Ontario, it's not really a great story for nuclear, right? The Ontario Energy Regulator are predicting the same shortfalls that we have in Australia. Right? I think nuclear doesn't magically create this energy that never stops. Right? Something else, as I mentioned in my speech, the actual energy regulator itself has found nuclear to be the most expensive form of energy in their current energy mix. And finally, I think it's actually worth mentioning Quebec, the province next door, offers power at half the price of Ontario. Do you want to have a guess how many nuclear reactors they have operating right now? Anyone? Zero. Sorry, sorry, it's rhetoric, but...
Because I might give you an answer.
Sorry, sorry, as I was teasing out, they don't have any at the moment, right?
Okay, no,
Just
okay, we'll come back to you. Okay, go be quick. Speak on the mic.
so, if cost and delay is your real concern about nuclear, are environmental costs taken into account and the loss of agricultural land, which has been overtaken by solar and wind farms, taken into account and costed?
So as far as I know, it's not, but I think you raise an interesting point. So Dutton's nuclear plan suggests that we'll have 7 reactors that plug and play at existing coal-fired power stations, right? His plan is that we will still have the renewables roll out to the same extent. I mean, these nuclear plants are going to produce 7 gigawatts of power. That's 2 to 3% of our 2050 forecast demand. It's not like under the nuclear plan that we're not going to need to build this transmission. I appreciate there are concerns about going through agricultural land, and I think landowners and communities need to be consulted. But I think it's farcical to suggest that somehow 7 gigawatts of nuclear power, the plug and play on coal-fired power stations, means we don't need this transmission. I mean, Dutton has said that this is going to complement the current renewables rollout. So, I mean, to your point, I don't know if it's actually taken into account, and I think it should be if it's not. But I don't think nuclear obviates the need for transmission under the Dutton plan.
Want to make a comment, Tony?
Yes, well, certainly the land use is a factor. Also getting, I suppose, approvals of farmers and other people to agree to having transmission lines or wind farms on their land could be a real problem for renewables. But ultimately, I think that could be resolved. But fundamentally, what we're not seeing today is a really proper debate about costs. We have on the one side Gen Cost and the government and people supporting the anti-nuclear position coming up with costs which nuclear experts just plain do not agree with and can demonstrate where the flaws are. The flaws are significant. They underestimate the costs of renewables and overestimate the cost of nuclear. And it all comes out to a conclusion in their favor. Well, that's just not good enough. This country should be a bit more directed, a bit tougher about this situation. And the only way to do that is to get rid of that legislation and then have some proper discussion, which would have to be done largely by nuclear experts and not scientists. SCSIRO is a wonderful body. There's scientists there. They're not really suited to look at this situation, which is an economic situation and a business situation and a geopolitical situation. These are not scientific issues. They're more practical issues. So unless we get real nuclear experts willing to come forward and be listened to, we're still going to have this debate as, oh, it costs too much, or no, it doesn't cost too much.
Okay. So look, there are plenty of questions here, but I've just got out of time. So I just want to finish on this one. Say if you came back in 2035 or 2050, with or without nuclear, I mean, is it possible for Australia to become renewable energy with the massive transformation of the economy that has to take place to do it? I mean, is it possible to meet the timelines or not? Because this is a huge development, isn't it? Rewiring the whole country in about 20 years or thereabouts.
Well, it is. So these targets, it's good to have targets because that motivates people to reach the targets. But there's a negative to every positive, and the negative is that people are saying that, well, if we don't reach the target, everything will stop. Well, it's not going to stop. The targets will not be reached. I think even Chris Bowen will recognize that. So we're going to go past the targets. The targets are not inconsequential, but they shouldn't be driving everything. What should be driving everything is the practicality of getting to a state where, we can get close to zero, but if we don't do it in 2050, well, maybe it's 2060. That shouldn't fuss people too much.
Okay, final comment?
So I think Tony and I agree, right? That these targets are what we should be aiming for, but if we don't meet them, it's not the end of the world. But I think my response to that would be, we shouldn't really let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? They're ambitious and achievable, but as the Climate Change Authority noted recently, we might not get there. The question then is, how do we get there while providing the most reliable and cheapest electricity? I would ask do we want to be scaring off the renewables investors that have money ready to go now? I would say probably not. Do we want to be creating plants that probably won't be ready until 2040? Probably not. So I think we're on the path, they're achievable, and I think we really shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we should put our head down and get on with it.
Okay, many thanks. Okay, there were more questions in the room, but we always finish on time, so I'm sorry about that, but we couldn't cover everyone. Look, terrific discussion tonight. That's what the Sydney Institute is all about. We have two intelligent and rational people discussing the topic in an intelligent and rational manner, and I'm sure these two papers, when they come out, and also it's filmed, of course, but it'll be very good for people to look at one view and another view and think about them. So we're very pleased to both our speakers, to Max and to Tony, for coming tonight. Well done, and thank you.